Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a bit of a landmark episode for us tonight, actually, episode 50 of SCOTONOMICS. So thanks very much for joining us tonight. We've got an absolutely packed 45 minutes, hopefully with Roger, and then we have another hour where we'll be speaking to Craig DL and Richard Murphy. So we've got a really busy hour and a half, and I hope you can join us. The first thing I'd like to do is welcome my co-host, who's here for the duration this evening, Kieran Van Sweden. Hi, Kieran. How are you doing?
I'm good. Yes. How are you?
I'm very well. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We've got viewers on Twitter, Facebook, and also on YouTube watching us tonight. We've got a fascinating episode. I've been keen to get Roger on for a while, so I'm really pleased we managed to get him for our 50th show. Roger Mullin, welcome to SCOTONOMICS.
Lovely to be here, and thanks very much for the invitation, William.
No, it's our pleasure. We're going to look at in a bit of detail the work you've been doing with Bottom Line Scotland, but I thought it's just worth mentioning and reminding our viewers that you used to be an SNP MP, and you're now working heavily involved in the Bottom Line Scotland think tank, and it's relatively new. I do want to get into that because I think that stuff's absolutely fascinating, what you've been working on, but I'd love to get your view on a couple of things. First of all is the Scottish Government's new economic paper, which was out at around about 12 o'clock today. I know you've been busy with everything else, but I wonder if you've got any comments on that. And then I want you to tell us your views on what's been happening down in Westminster in terms of the economy of the UK over the last few weeks. How does that sound?
That sounds absolutely grand. I mean, you're asking me to be a politician again, that is to comment on a paper I've not read. Because I'm not all that long in after a very busy day. So I've heard some of the journalistic comment and looked at, I think, the first page of the summary. So that's all. So I cannot speak with expertise on it. But what I would say is there's a couple of things that strike me as very encouraging. One was that it would appear from journalistic comment that part of it is framed in exactly what the Bottom Line are doing, talking about the price of dependence. In other words, we need to change the narrative to it not all about justifying independence, but pointing out what the failure of the UK state, failure of the UK economy is, and why that is what is really driving Scotland down. So I welcome that framing. I note there are things in it about the European Union and the like, which I particularly welcome because for many years I've been interested in problems of demography and migration and the like. So all I can say is once this programme is over, I look forward to reading it.
Well, great. Well, I hope you can join the discussion with for a little bit or catch up on it with Richard and Craig afterwards, because we're going to go real deep dive into that. That's on our new SCOTONOMICS YouTube channel. I'll post a link for everyone watching. We've got a little comment from Tricia Slater here, who it sounds like you know. She says, "Hi, Roger. Great to see you looking so well."
Oh, thanks very much, Tricia. I haven't talked to Tricia in a long time. I first met her when I worked for a time part-time with the Open University.
Oh, there you go, the wonder of social media. Okay, the second question we wanted to look at, Westminster in the last few weeks. What's your kind of summary on what's been happening, I suppose, since Truss took over?
Well, I mean, chaos isn't an appropriate enough word for what's going on, but let's just use that at the moment. I have never in my lifetime, which I think is a lot longer than yours, William, lived through a period of such utter turmoil at the heart of a government. I mean, everything about, there is nothing that is going on at the moment that seems to talk to any basic competence, either politically, economically, or in terms just of communication, in terms of engaging with people. So it's a really dreadful situation. Also, the type of chaos as it has emerged has made me reflect on the fact that if ever you needed an example as to why you can't understand an economy by only looking at technical economics, this is it. Because you cannot separate out the economy from the wider political environment, the wider legal environment, and so on. So, I think we need to have an element of rediscovering the old Scottish tradition of political economy to begin to get some understanding of what's going on. But utterly shambolic. And the reversal is now going to have to be more than a reversal to try and recapture some sense of people's faith in the way in which governance is being conducted. And I don't know how that's going to be accomplished in the UK. It's been on the slide, as we know, for a number of years. A loss of faith in the way in which governance arrangements are undertaken in the UK. This has just made it worse in spades. And I can't see how the UK, as we have traditionally understood it, are going to be able to recover in terms of political trust.
That's a really interesting perspective, and I would agree completely, Roger. And it's so much more about just those figures, and an economy is all about the institutions and the structure and the trust and the competency of everything that supports an economy, and all of that seems to be missing at the moment. Kieran, I know you've had a little bit of a chance to look at the paper. I know you're exceptionally busy as well, but I just wondered if you wanted to give us a very brief summary of what you've thought so far, and also your thoughts on what's been happening at Westminster.
Yeah, so of course, this morning I was listening to Radio Scotland and hearing, of course, that the Chancellor was going to make a statement as well, which I haven't managed to read anything about because I've been at work and then come home and tried to read as much of the paper as I could before this programme. But yeah, the paper, I've listed some pros and some cons. So the first part really is more an introductory section, I would describe it as. So there's quite a lot of things that I try to look at it as a piece of new work for someone who's not a hardened activist, someone who's really coming new to this idea. For example, I have an activist friend in Edinburgh whose 96-year-old father is looking at this paper, and this is the first thing from the Scottish Government he's going to take a look at. So, looking at it from that perspective, I think there's some really positive things in that they're talking about, for example, things that people don't realise, for example, our renewable sector and how big that is. So there was a lot of work done by Business for Scotland, and you can clearly see a lot of the research from Business for Scotland is within this paper as well. And they are using a lot of figures from 2019, which I think is fair enough, because obviously the past 2 years of the pandemic are not the norm. And I think you have to go back to 2019 to look at what the norm is. So I think they do a really good job of talking up the Scottish economy and making people more aware of just how good the Scottish economy is. And, certainly on the doorsteps I've found with older people when I'm talking to them, they really have no idea about our renewables sector and how successful that is. They have no idea about how successful Dundee is as the, the global capital of video games. Dundee is the Hollywood of video games, and it brings, so there's a lot of really good things pointed out economically in that paper, which I think is important for the general public to understand first and foremost about our real resources.
Great. Well, let's get to we can speak about that more in depth when we come over. And just your very brief summary of the last few weeks in Westminster.
So me or
yeah, Kieran.
Oh well, it is chaos, and like Roger says, I think it's becoming increasingly obvious to people just how politics can affect the economy, especially when the pound had parity with the dollar. See today it was sitting at $1.13. You can really see now. I mean, but I saw this when Boris Johnson came in initially as well, because the value of the pound went up then because he was talking about doing deficit spending on infrastructure, infrastructure spending. So obviously the markets, people who are buying bonds, British bonds are seeing that as a positive thing. They see investment in the country as a positive. And I think that's something that a lot of, not all Conservatives, that's not fair, but a lot of Conservatives more really on the right of the party don't seem to understand that.
Yeah, no, a really, really interesting perspective. Roger, let's jump in there.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment when Karen was mentioning the value of the pound, which I think today is, as she said, at $1.13. I was telling some people a story of around the first time I was selected to run for Parliament in South Ayrshire in the early 1970s, believe it or not, when I was at a meeting one time in Muirkirk, and this opponent, who was very against Scottish independence, said, if you looked at Scottish independence, you'd be lucky if your pound was worth $2.
There's a lot changed in that time.
Because it was standing at over $2.40 at that time. It just shows you what the decline over many years has been.
Yeah. And I think that is a natural and a gradual decline from our role having an empire and removing the resources and all of the wealth from our empire. As a small country, we were bound to drift quite considerably from where we were as we entered as we left the empire and the colonies in the 50s. So I think that has been a gradual decline. Roger, let's have a chat about your organisation then. So Bottom Line Scotland, why did you start it? What are you hoping to achieve with it? And I suppose a big question, kind of why now? Why did you start now?
Right, well, this actually started because of a conversation I was having some time back with my good friend David Simpson. David was at the time the professor at Strathclyde who started up the Fraser of Allender Institute, and he moved on from there. David wrote the first paper on the independence for Scotland, the first economic paper, just over 50 years ago, would you believe? And what he said to me was, he said, for about the last 50 years, when people have been talking about economics, it has tended to always be putting the case for Scotland on the defensive by saying we have to justify what the costs of independence would be. He said, I think we have been too poor at pointing out to people what the price of dependence has been. He says, and the price of dependence measured in all sorts of ways has been huge. So I thought about this and then had a chat with a few people, including towards the latter stage when I was on the NEC in the last couple of years for 1 year. And I mentioned this and got quite a bit of encouragement from people to say, well, you should think about doing something about that. You should focus on it. So that was the germ. And I went back and I talked to David and a few others. And so eventually we decided what we would do is we would get together. We would do this independently of party or money, so that we do this entirely on our own on a voluntary basis, so that we can have our own independent voice, as it were. We obviously hope what we're doing will help the debate about Scottish independence. We are all devoted to the cause of Scottish independence and make that quite clear. But our purpose is to try and elevate the debate and also to turn the narrative towards focusing on exactly what has the cost been of dependence, how we all suffer from it. So that was the idea. And then, of course, we spent ages, as sometimes happens, just talking about, well, how are we going to do this? Where do we start? Originally, we thought we would try and write just 1 or 2 papers. But we soon recognized, James, this is going to be a very large undertaking. And we decided it would be a large undertaking, not just because there was so much to do and so much data to explore, but also because we wanted to take this thing called a political economy approach. So that the most recent papers, one is a case study of the water industry and how it has been able to flourish once it was brought under public control in Scotland. And the one before that, which was largely my own baby, was one on corruption in the UK and the huge impact that has. As well as the very first paper we produced was a general paper, which I suppose you might say is more framed on the sort of psychology of what we're about, looking at the concept of agency and dependency and what the relative merits are of both and how we should frame things. So our attempt has been to we then constructed for ourselves, well, what do we want to talk about? And within a short space of time, we realized we needed a minimum of 12 papers to produce. So a bit bigger an undertaking than we originally thought. And so we've now published the first 5. We are now adding to the 12. So this is going to be a big job. And the main thing we want to do is to stimulate good quality discussion. You know, I don't mind if people disagree with any of our papers or take issue with them. But what I hope we're doing is writing things that are well-founded, that are well-written and hopefully engaging for people, and that can stimulate debate. None of us in the bottom line think we've got all the answers, and that's because we don't believe anybody has got all the answers. But what we need to do is search for the best understanding we can, and so that's basically what our purpose is.
Yeah, I mean, I would say to you, two of the really obvious things that have been a cost to Scotland from being within the Union are a loss of real resources, in the sense of we've lost population share, which was much greater in 1707 at the Act of Union. And the other thing that, as a keen follower of the tax justice network, we lose currency all the time. So, you know, we get a dollop of currency every year to spend in Scotland, and people can just funnel it out of Scotland in all kinds of ways, and that's facilitated by Westminster.
Yeah, it's not only facilitated by Westminster, it's facilitated by the overall culture of economics in the UK. So that, for example, given the size of the UK, it is probably world leading, or certainly
Yes.
it is world leading in the amount of money laundering that takes place, that funnels money in and out of the system. And I've always found it amazing that you get some people make a career out of economics and writing books in economics, and you never find anything at all they have to say about the extent of economic crime and corruption. And yet we know from lots of international studies, including there was one a couple of years ago by the European Union, pointed out that the more corrupt or corruption takes place in any economy, the slower is going to be its growth rate, and the worse it's going to be in terms of well-being. So it's something that's why we've had one paper on that, and we'll have a lot more papers to deal with other aspects. But we hope what we're producing so far is interesting and reasonably well researched.
Brilliant. Well, we've got a question already from Charles. So he said, what sort of vehicle should Indie Scotland create to deal with corruption and state capture by dark money? Thanks, Charles. That's a great question.
Yeah, it's very good. And I'm delighted that Charles has mentioned state capture, because that's talked about in our corruption paper, state capture. I mean, basically, there's a whole host of things needing to be done. But the first one that I would give priority is to establish an anti-corruption authority. The UK doesn't have one. What the UK has is lots and lots of responsibilities placed in little pockets here, there, and everywhere. And we get lots of different regulators and all the rest of it. And it's not joined up. But more to the point, when you look at every single one of the regulators and the law enforcement agencies that exist in the UK, there is not a single one that is charged with anti-corruption. We do get, for example, law and order involved when they find a crime. But that's a different thing from trying to prevent corruption and prevent crime from taking place. We don't have that. So the first thing I would do in an independent Scotland is I would make sure we could have a joined up approach to this, and that part of the function is not just to chase criminals once they have found to be doing wrong, but is actually to set in place mechanisms, institutions, and cultures that prevent corruption in the first place. So that would be the first thing I would do. I would then make sure that bodies that are supposed to oversee aspects of the structure of the economy are resourced to do so. So that, as some of you may know, when I was an MP for a couple of years, I fought quite hard to try and get changes to bring Scottish limited partnerships or pull them away from the criminal activities that they were associated with. And I found colossal resistance in Westminster to reforming these sorts of bodies. So I started asking a few questions, written questions. One question I asked was for Companies House, and I asked, how many businesses are actually registered at Companies House? To which the answer back in 2016 was almost 4.5 million businesses registered as active in the UK. So I then followed this up with another written question, which, if I summarize it, it was along the lines of, how many full-time equivalent staff are there to supervise those registrations to make sure they're legitimate? To which the answer was 6. So there was 6 full-time equivalent to try and manage the registrations of 4.5 million businesses, companies, limited partnerships, and all the rest of it. In other words, they were not resourced to do it. And that's why you get, if you ever want to entertain yourself in a peculiar kind of way, if you look through Companies House, you will see the most bizarre registrations of companies.
Someone on Twitter who spends every day, he goes on and picks out new registrations from Companies House. I'll have to forward you the link if you've not seen it. But, you know, it is that 15 different businesses have been registered to a block of flats in Elgin, you know, that are just completely got nothing to do, clearly nothing to do with the business that's working there. That's really, I'd love to find a little bit more on that. You've 2 points I'd like to pick up on. The first one is I'd like you to explain a little bit more about how corruption manifests itself in the UK. And then secondly, where the UK via the City of London sits in this kind of whole money laundering corruption web that we know exists at the moment.
Right. Well, London is probably the leading centre for money laundering in the world. In fact, I don't know if you've ever had a look at a recent book called Butler to the World. And in that, it actually spells out very clearly what all the different mechanisms are that are used. But the little analogy I would give to people to show you how bizarre this UK is if anybody listening to this program, somebody like yourself, William, decides, I'm going to open a wee bank account tomorrow, and you wander down the street and you go into a bank and you say, I want to start up a wee deposit account, what's going to happen to you? You're going to be asked first to provide proof of your identity, probably hand over a passport or something like that. Secondly, using a different source, you're going to have to identify what your legitimate address is. Right? And then, if you satisfy these different requirements, which they say are for money laundering requirements, and you then open an account, as we know, in a bank account, the bank is able to scrutinize your account every second of the day, right? However, if you want to launder a lot of illegal money through the UK, what do you do first of all? Well, you might want to set up some kind of company, or even better, a limited partnership. So what's involved there? Well, it's still the case today that you could register a Scottish limited partnership And one, you don't need to say who you are, let alone prove who you are. Two, you declare an address knowing that that address is never going to be checked out by Government House. It doesn't need to be it needs to be a real address that people could find, but it doesn't need to be your address. That's why your example, William, of you said 15 companies at one address. I can take you to Douglas in South Lanarkshire to a wee shop that's got thousands at the one address registered, all being used without the permission of the person who actually owns that wee property in Main Street, Douglas. And so what you've got is you've got the means of setting up institutions that will allow you to remain secret. And also, unlike if you're a limited company, you've got to make annual returns. You've got to give financial statements every year to Companies House. If you register yourself as a limited partnership, you don't need even to make that. So there is no transparency whatsoever. You don't know who's controlling it, but they're then able to trade on the fact that I've established a legitimate business. Here's my business number with Companies House in the UK. And that gives them a mechanism by which they can begin to funnel all sorts of assets.
It looks like it's been facilitated by the current process. And Roger, I live in Spain, and I set up a company in Spain a couple of years ago, and it cost me over nearly €1,500 to set it up. And the amount of information that I had to provide, we had to go to a notary, and everything had to be signed off and officially. And this is what most countries are like, or maybe a little bit not quite as
Absolutely.
But the UK is an absolute outlier, and it's a wonderful example of how the corruption is there. It's really obvious, and there's nothing done about it. And
but it serves the interests of the City of London, because they're making queens of bonuses and out of these kinds of activities. You know, let's not forget there's a lot of self-interest here, and other people who get self-interest in it are people like large accountancy firms, right? People like large legal firms and the like. They can get very substantial sums out of serving the interests of, oligarchs and other types of people.
It is one of the there's no shadow of a doubt about that. We're actually interviewing Nicholas Shaxson. SCOTONOMICS in a couple of weeks, and he's going to talk about corruption, but also the power of corporations and what that does to democracy. So we're really lucky to be speaking to him then. I'll see if we've got any other questions for you. Let's see. Here's a good one here from Billy. So lobbying is the root of most government corruption. How do you make open democracy count so that it ends? So the power to lobby. Any thoughts on that, Roger?
Well, I mean, one thing that you could do is there are two things. You get different types of lobbying. I think many types of lobbying could be outlawed quite easily in law to be prevented, which some types of lobbying are not. Some types of lobbying, I think, are perfectly legitimate. So that if somebody came along to me as an MP saying, I'm lobbying you because I represent this charity that's got a particular interest, I'm fine with that. Somebody comes along and they want you to serve their economic interests because they've got a private company and all the rest of it, I think that's different. But there are other aspects of this as well. One of the things that I think is particularly bad in the UK is that we've got this thing called the revolving door, so that not just politicians, but senior civil servants will often move from their world into the world of business and sometimes back again. And so what you get is this insidious relationship created in the UK between the political structure that is supposed to be there to serve the interests of the broad citizenry in a democracy, but you've got them tied to the interests of very particular economic actors. And this revolving door of people, it's very usual for very senior civil servants to leave when they might only be in their 50s and move into directorships with companies they were dealing with when they were senior civil servants. And we know that this goes on amongst certain types of politicians as well. So there are things like the revolving door that needs to be shut and the like. But I mean, I take it very seriously that what we need to do is look at the overall culture. What kind of culture do we want in our society in terms of economic culture? And we need to make sure we've got the institutions and the laws and the leadership to make sure we want to serve the legitimate interests, not the illegitimate interests.
Fantastic. I think these are such important areas, and I'm sure if we go through that economic paper from the Scottish Government, I'm pretty confident that it won't cover these areas. It won't talk about corruption and money laundering and institutions. And, you know, there's so much to cover, and it's only a relatively small document. But I think these things are absolutely crucial. I've been speaking to Richard Murphy about corporate governance. And again, how much that affects the economy, or how companies are structured and what they're entitled and told to do with regard to their duty to shareholders and other stakeholders. So these things are really, really important. Now, as an ex-MP, what role do you think MPs have? Because we spoke about that revolving door, but we also know that a lot of MPs have second, third, fourth jobs. And also, I'll lay my hand on the figure. I'll try and post it into the comments later. But I'm pretty sure that of the top 100 FTSE companies in the UK, around half of them have a current MP serving on the board. And the international average is less than 10% for companies with serving MPs. So again, the UK is a real outlier. It might even be higher than 50%. I'll try and find that figure. But what role do you think MPs have specifically around clamping down on this culture of corruption?
Well, I think they first of all got to care about it and start to act as if they cared about it. You know, I was, in all honesty, shocked that when I began to take up the issue of Scottish limited partnerships, I naively thought, you know, every MP is immediately going to say, oh, I didn't know that was happening, Roger. Sure, we'll need to close all these loopholes. What I got was precisely the reverse. I remember I sat in the Regulatory Reform Select Committee, and I was raising the issue of the need to clamp down on aspects of Scottish limited partnerships. And exactly at the same day, surreptitiously, the UK government launched another 2 types of limited partnerships that were even less regulated than SLPs. Why did they do that? Because they were asked to do it by financiers in the City of London who wanted to make sure that some of their activities could be hidden behind limited partnerships, which meant that they would no longer need to disclose certain types of information. So I think the first thing is we need to get people elected in politics who actually care about this and who want to close these abuses down. Secondly, I've always believed that I mean, it's different at, say, a local authority level when the people you elect are part-time or on extremely low amounts of money paid for their public services, leaving aside that aspect of it. But people who get elected to some form of national office, whether it's Westminster, or, Holyrood, or the like, we should at least make sure that they are full-time politicians, because that's what they're paid to be. Right? But I remember when I was an MP, there was another MP who hardly ever turned up for anything. Right? And in fact, it took me it was about a year and a half into me being an MP, this guy turned up one day, and some of his colleagues, who's a Tory, were laughing and saying, "I'll bet you've not seen this guy before, Roger." He never comes along, because he was making huge sums of money as a QC, who we called a KC. So he had his full-time activity devoted to his legal practice, not what he was elected for. Now, I think that is just ridiculous that that kind of thing can happen. It's less likely to happen in a place like Holyrood, not least because Holyrood is more open and people can see things going on. But I still think it's something that we need to be very mindful of. And particularly once we get to the stage of getting close to independence, we're good, in my opinion, we're going to need a parliament that has got a lot more people in it than is currently in Holyrood.
I think the transparency is really important, and I think
transparency is really important, and we need to think about how we do that.
MPs and MSPs who have property that they rent, for example, that's one area where transparency in that would allow you to judge the decisions they are making with all the evidence. And we know that there are a lot of MPs who are making decisions on rent and mortgages who have this as part of their kind of capital and maybe even their business. So I think this transparency is really important, and it's great you're doing that. Another thing would be kind of the role of the City of London. I mean, the City of London have a formal role within Westminster, and they're effectively lobbying for the City of London every day in Westminster. Is that correct? Or surely that's a bit of an exaggeration?
Well, I think it's probably a fair description of what goes on. But what it is it tends to be associated mainly with them having extraordinarily close ties to the Tory party, I would have to say. And if you look at the number of Conservative members and look at what their background is, you will find a disproportionate number come from the financial services sector in the City of London. You then get this problem at Westminster in terms of debates, that people whose only experience has been economically being in the financial sector in the City of London as investors, investing other people's money, or gambling, shorting the pound and things like that, right? When it comes to their influence in economics, they're seeing it through this very narrow prism. So we shouldn't really be terribly surprised that in the mini budget, you would find that it said we needed to improve the attractiveness to the UK of people to, we needed to improve the attractiveness to bring people here. But the only initiatives that were taken were for hugely well-paid financiers, and the Chancellor, as he was then, Kwasi Kwarteng, specifically said it was to attract people to London. He didn't recognise any other part of the UK. It was only...
It's really... Roger, we've got a few questions from the audience, which I'd like to go through before we leave you.
Can I just interject here? It's I think he's called the Remembrancer. He sits beside the Speaker. He's the representative of the City of London. He sits in the chamber in Westminster every day, as far as I know. Is that the case, Roger? I'm pretty sure I read that.
Oh, well, I wouldn't know. Nobody introduced me to him.
He was there on all the days when that MP certainly wasn't there. A quick one from Billy here. Would a minimum term for serving in public office not help in cutting corruption?
I've never heard that raised before, so my quick answer is I don't know. A minimum term for serving in public...
Yeah, so you only do 2 terms as an MP, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how that would help off the top of my head. I mean, it would strike me that, some people can be corrupt from day one.
Yeah, that's a good... What a lovely quote. What a lovely quote. Roger, use that one. Yeah, Billy, I think that is a really good question. Really good question. We've got a question from one of our regular viewers, Hashby Stumble here. Has any MP picked up where you left off questioning the UK government about Scottish limited partnerships?
Yes. In particular, Alison Fulis. In fact, when I lost my seat in 2017, within a very short space of time, I got a phone call from Ian Blackford and then Alison, and what they were saying and I was very gratified. What they were saying to me was, could I supply them with the contacts because they wanted to keep going on this? So the answer, I'm very pleased to say, is yes. And in fact, it was only in the last 2 weeks or thereabouts, I was messaging Alison about an issue and she was messaging me. So yes, it has been picked up, but it's and I can tell you, it's thankless. It's hard work trying to get movement in Westminster to try and deal with some of these matters.
I think that's a perfect example. The Scottish government, even if it wanted to, couldn't get involved because this is not devolved. The area of the law isn't devolved. If it is, we could move a little bit quicker. So I'd like to finish. We've got a few minutes left, Roger, and I'd like to kind of have a summary of what do you think is this cost of dependence, not just economically, but socially and also politically?
Yes, well, that's a very good question for me, William, because it allows me to advertise some of our forthcoming papers. Because although first couple of our papers used very traditional measures of GDP in some of our analysis, we have continually pointed out, but this is a very narrow way of understanding an economy. And so that we are moving on. In about 2 papers' time, we are going to start producing stuff on well-being. Like, what is the purpose of an economy? The purpose of an economy is there to serve the people. Right? It should be there to help them have a better life. It should be there to help them have a healthy and a happy life. And we're going to begin to move on to do an analysis of that. I can say, and this will come as no great surprise, we're actually finding a fairly similar thing, looking at different measures of well-being internationally, looking at what has happened in terms of even basic financial measures like GDP. And that is, we're falling behind some of our comparable small advanced countries that we should be able to compare ourselves with. You know, one of the things I hope that we begin to stimulate and influence people on is to say, we need to stop this obsession with only wanting to compare ourselves with England, right? We need to compare ourselves with the best. And we need to not borrow exactly what they're doing, but learn from what it is they are enabled to do because they have got more control of their economy and their communities. And so that's what we're going to be moving on to in the coming months.
Great.
So, yeah. So what's the economy about? At the end of the day, it's about people.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you know, from everything you've been saying, I see that you've got a much more holistic view, a kind of heterodox approach to the economy. And it's not all about the figures. It is about what the economy's there to do. And, you know, the economy sits in society, which sits within the planetary boundaries and the biosphere. And that's a really important way. And I think that came across from Nicola Sturgeon's presentation today and was around well-being. But we still seem to have this drive to growth, which I think is a real issue as we move forward in the next decade. So,
could I just leave you with one wee quote from one of our papers, right, which I've written down here. And that is, in our first paper, we effectively addressed the issue of why society, or us being together, matters. And we did it by quoting Adam Smith. And what Adam Smith wrote was, individualism is loneliness, not liberation. Belonging does not shackle us to burdens, it brings us home to humanity. And I think that sort of view of the ethics of an economy is very important for us to remember.
Well, absolutely, we would agree. Karen, would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yes.
Well, Roger, we'd love to have you come back on and speak about that paper that you're doing around well-being, because we've actually had Phil Lawn, who's one of the kind of international leaders on the Genuine Progress Indicator, coming on, and we would like to know a little bit more about that when it goes to press. Thank you so much for your time tonight. We've managed to get right on to 45 minutes, so thanks very much, consummate professional. Great to meet you and to speak to you, and enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope you get through that paper at some point over the next couple of days.
Thanks very much. Thanks, William, and thanks, Ken.
Bye now.
Bye, Roger.